Dr. John Powers, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's wonderful to be sitting with you again. It was really enjoyable for me. Our first episode, and it's was one of those episodes that sort of left me with more questions than answers, which is really wonderful because it means that I haven't necessarily solved anything, but the quest continues. So such a privilege to hang out with you again.
Great. I think it's much better to have a lot of good questions
Yeah.
than to have a lot of set answers.
I think that is probably something that's going to represent the theme of our discussion today. Having a bit of a deeper dive into your work, and there's lots of questions around Tibetan Buddhism specifically that I want to speak to you about because I know you're really quite the expert when it comes to that. But this idea of the world, sort of being a place where questions give us more of the answer, paradoxically, than trying to solve anything. If we could segue from that into a rather humbling question, what is God to you, John? How do you conceive of God? And perhaps we could unpack it a little bit.
Well, I'm an atheist, so to me, God is a myth that people make up and that they believe in. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. I have a degree from Holy Cross College, an undergraduate degree in theology, and I won prizes for my theology work there. And when I was in graduate school, my secondary concentration was Western religious thought. So I
Mm.
spent a lot of time examining it. And from whatever angle I've looked at it, I just can't see any way that it can make sense. And particularly when you start getting into some of the details, it becomes so problematic, so full of contradictions. And I don't really see why. I mean, I guess I could see for some people why it would work and why they would want something like that. Uh, but when you start looking at the ramifications of it, the conceptual ramifications, it seems so full of holes, so full of contradictions, so deeply unrealistic and unbelievable that I just don't see how you could hold on to that for very long. I think the only way you could really do it, as far as I can tell, is to really not look into the questions too deeply, because when you start really looking at it and start drawing out the conceptual ramifications, it just doesn't work.
I suppose that's what I was interested to hear your thoughts on because a lot of people who perhaps broaden the definition of God out to something beyond the conceptual started to give rise to, ideas around impermanence, the non-self, the suchness of everything, the everythingness
Mhm.
of everything, um, as opposed to God being a sort of supreme being or an entity or a ruler. Um, but perhaps does that give you more? Is there more room to play around with the idea of God in that realm for you?
Not really to me, because these are things that are qualities of reality. So, like impermanence, emptiness, things, these are simply the way things are. And these are things that can be verified through empirical evidence and through reasoning. That is, you can look at reality, you can look at the world around, you can see that things are permanent, they're changing all the time. You can see that they're empty, they have no inherent existence, and that any attempt to posit some sort of enduring essence, it just doesn't hold up under analysis. Whereas God, to make any sense at all, as a concept, God has to be at least a sentient being. Whereas emptiness can't be a sentient being; it's simply a quality, like heat or electricity or something like that. These are things that you can observe in the world around you. But to say, well, heat is all around us and it enables us to live, and so that's like God. Well, you can call it that, but it doesn't really, it's not a very satisfying concept of God for a theistic person.
Yes.
Because, the reason why, I know a lot of people who are believers in one religion or another, and the reason that they talk about, why they find it works for them is that there's a sense of personal connection, a sense that there is this being that's omnipresent, that created them, that loves them, that sustains them, that's laid out a path for them to follow and things like that. And it's also, well, it's so full of contradictions to me. Like, so on the one hand, God is omniscient and omnipotent. He knew from the beginning exactly how everything was going to work out. He knew what everybody was going to do, and yet people believe that they also have free will. But that makes no sense at all if
Mm,
God knew what was going to happen in advance, and that's what every major religion believes.
mm,
And so, it all seems like very arbitrary to me that you have and when this idea was first formulated in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there was only like people only knew about basically a small area of the Middle East. They
Mm,
didn't really even have a concept of, of the Earth, and certainly not of the solar system or the universe. And the idea that you have trillions of galaxies out there, and the idea that this could have all been created by a single being, and and that there wasn't any sun until the seventh day, sixth day, and so therefore, like God must have lived in darkness for billions of years until he thought, "Oh, I should make some light." So
yeah, yeah,
to me, it just uh, the more you know about the world, the less sense you can make of the whole God concept. But
yeah.
again, for people who find that comforting, that's fine. I have no problem with people who want to believe that. It's just that I'm the sort of person who likes to analyze things and who likes to have a strong sense that the conclusions that I come to are based on evidence and analysis, and that I have good reasons for them. Uh, Not because they make me feel good. There are a lot of things that I prefer to be the case that aren't. And the more I look at things and see the way things are, I would prefer it that way, to
Yeah.
have a sense of the way things are based on empirical observation and analysis. For other people who have different orientations, that's fine. It doesn't affect me one way or the other. It's, their decision.
Mm, No, I certainly agree with your point about wanting to know what's real as opposed to sort of living in a fantasy realm that I like, but also have this sort of nudging frustration. There's something isn't quite right about it. It's just, I suppose what I'm trying to figure out is there are a lot of people who I imagine believe in a theistic God, to your point, people who believe literally, that there is a savior and that there is an objective morality, I suppose, a sort of way to live life that will have me saved, at the point at which I die. There are also other different conceptions. Even that word to me sounds limiting because we're trying to understand and analyze and define something that's beyond comprehension to some degree.
Mhm.
Um, where I'm going with this, John, is I've really fallen in love with Martin Heidegger. I've been, trying to grapple with being and time. And one thing that I find really interesting about his exploration there is that um, the way in which we approach the question of being in itself prevents us from actually getting to the truth of what it is, quote unquote, for everyone sort of listening at home, rather trying to understand being or suchness. I think from memory, he did not want being to have anything to do with God, and yet I think he had some sort of connection with a Taoist or someone who was of that worldview. His idea, I suppose, was to try to understand being through how it operates, how it discloses itself. And maybe I'm not, by no means am I trying to sort of change your idea on what God is, but I'm just trying to look at the ways in which different religions or different ideas would speak to that which we call God. And obviously, Judeo-Christianity speaks to it as a sort of supreme being, but perhaps there are more Eastern realms that speak to it in some other way. I'm not sure.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that before I retired recently, one of the ways I made my living was teaching a course on Asian religions, which I did pretty much every year, at least once.
Yeah.
And so in this course, we would look at several different non-Western religions. So we started with Hinduism and then Buddhism and then Jainism and then Taoism, Confucianism, and Shinto,
Mm,
each of which has a very different version. And one of the things that I always started with my students was pointing out that in order to really make sense of religion, the thing you have to understand is that every religion begins with a problematic. There is something that identifies as the core problem, and then everything else flows from that because the rest of it is basically all the important stuff for believers is how you deal with that problem, right?
mm. Nice.
So with Christianity, the core problem is original sin, right? And so because a couple of people thousands of years ago ate a piece of fruit, everybody is now damned to eternal damnation unless God decides to bail them out. But the problem is there's nothing you can really do. Like you can't earn God's redemption. You can only open yourself to God's grace and hope that it happens because otherwise, you're screwed.
Mm,
The
mm,
problem with that, of course, is that if the only way to do this is through uh, embracing this message that you find in the Gospels, what about all the people who never even hear the Gospels?
Yeah.
And the other problem from that is, even people who do, who are born into situations where they grow up with another religious tradition, it's very unlikely that they're going to hear the Gospels and convert. Conversion is an extremely rare phenomenon. And I would guess about 99% of all religious believers are in the religion they were born into.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you have these probably hundreds of thousands of religions and only one is actually true, the luck that would be required for you to be born into the right one is pretty phenomenal.
Yes.
And then there's also the problem of all the others who weren't that lucky.
Yes, that's right.
And like say, remote tribes in the Amazon who will never have any contact with the gospel or with the word of God, they're screwed and there's nothing they can do about it. It's not their fault. It's just that, these people ate an apple thousands of years ago. And so the people in the Amazon are going to hell, I suppose.
Mm, mm.
And I find that all, deeply problematic. The theology of this to me is like, the more you look into it, the more problematic it becomes.
Yes. Okay, so what were some of the problems that some of the Eastern Asian religions were trying to struggle with or grapple with? What were the first principles?
Well, Hinduism is more problematic in that it's so diverse that it's hard to say anything is Hindu. But at least the traditions that I've mainly studied, the biggest problem is cyclic existence. We're born over and over and over again, and because of that, we suffer, and we suffer cluelessly.
Mm,
So we don't know that we're going to suffer. We don't know that the actions we do are counterproductive. And so they lead to future rebirth. And even if we lead a generally good life, the fact that we are attached to the things of the world creates a conceptual linkage, which means that we're going to come back again because there's still things within the world that are pleasant to us that we desire and so forth. And so until we come to understand the way things really are, see the world the way it is, we're going to continue with this endless cycle, beginning of the cycle. It's a cycle that is beginningless, but it can be ended. And the problem is cognitive, so the solution is cognitive. The solution is to wake up to the reality of things, and through an introspective process of meditation, that's at least one way to get out. There are others too. But generally speaking, through introspective practice of meditation, you can come to see the way the world is, and that will make you completely dispassionate toward the world. And through that dispassion, you'll no longer create those causes and conditions that would have brought you back again.
Oh, there's so many areas we could walk down there. I love that. So, okay, so one thing I really have to ask first is, do you take the cyclical birth, death, and then rebirth idea as a literal truth or as a metaphorical truth? Where do you sit with that? As an
Well,
empiricist, as you said before.
it's certainly literal for traditional Buddhist teachers, Hindu teachers, Jain teachers, Sikh teachers. So at least, from the point of view of Indian religions, at least those four, it's certainly a reality. That's the way things are. My point of view is that that does go against what we see of the world. That is, what we see is that everybody who was ever born has died and their body is decomposed.
Mm,
So there's no reliable evidence of people coming back again. Now, there is anecdotal evidence, and
mm,
there's some interesting stories that people found of people who report past life memories,
yeah.
even people who are born into societies where that's not a part of the worldview. You would sort of expect it in societies like Buddhist society where something that people believe. But there was a person at University of Virginia when I was a graduate student there named Ian Stevenson,
Right.
who did
Yes.
some really interesting studies of reports of people who said that they had memories that he thought couldn't be explained any other way. And he
Mm,
was very much a skeptic. He went into this with the idea that he was going to debunk this idea, but he found that several of the people that he interviewed, he couldn't see any other way of making sense of what they were saying other than the rebirth hypothesis.
mm.
And I find that very interesting. I don't find it convincing, but I do find it interesting. So my point of view is that I'm open to it, and I spent a lot of time with some Buddhist teachers who I consider to be very wise, and these are people who have done introspective meditations that have enabled them to open up aspects of consciousness that are not accessible to most people. And they report that they can see with direct perception this operation of birth, death, and rebirth, the way the karma operates and things like that. And, many of them are actually fairly matter of fact about the whole thing. Like, you'll ask them something like, I'm wondering how my grandmother's doing, and they'll say, oh, she's doing really well, and they never say, oh shit, this is bad. So, it's always reassuring, but they're very matter of fact about the whole thing. And so the
Wow.
the analogy that I use for this, not that I necessarily believe it, but the analogy that I use is that this is considered by the Buddhists and by the Hindus too to be an aspect of consciousness that can be developed. It's called yogic direct perception. And this enables us to see aspects of reality that are normally hidden from the ordinarily developed six senses. And so I like to compare it to, at least the way the tradition understands it, to being like, say, somebody tells you that in a glass of water there are thousands of little microorganisms. You say, I'm looking at it, I don't see anything. And so then you use a microscope, and the microscope shows you all these microorganisms swimming around. So with an enhanced perception, something that magnifies it, you can see the microorganisms, so you can verify it through direct perception. And so from the point of view of this tradition, yogic correct perception is like that. That is, it's a faculty that we have that, when developed, enables us to see these patterns and connections that are hidden from us now. So, I've met people who've done these sorts of meditations. They certainly are, some of the ones that I've met are clearly much wiser and more clued in than other people, certainly more clued in than me. And so I'm willing to suspend my judgment on this until I go through that too and see if it holds up, under my own experience.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a hypothesis that if you act as if that's the case, you can practice meditation in an effective way, but still suspend judgment because you don't have any reason based on your own evidence to be able to say, yes, this is absolutely true.
That's a really good point there. So just to make sure I got what you said there, if you act as if it's true, uh, then the way that you practice meditation is obviously going to be influenced by that and lead you there. But how much of the placebo could sort of um, give you the illusion that that's what's actually happening?
Well, that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time studying Buddhist meditation, and what it really is about, it's about repatterning your mind. It's about restructuring your thinking. And so, with say Tibetan tantric meditation, you start with an image of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, and you use that as a template for what you want your own mind to look like. And so you fill in all of the positive qualities like wisdom, compassion, generosity, ethics, and so forth. And you visualize this being outside of you that has all these qualities. And then in the next phase, after you've made a stable visualization, you invite this being to merge with you, and you visualize yourself actually becoming that being and
Mm.
having the body, the speech, and the mind of this being and performing the activities of the being. And the idea is that the more you do this, the more natural it becomes for you, and the more you actually come to approach that state because you're actually doing it. You're sort of putting it into practice in your daily life. So it's like a fake it till you make it sort of thing,
Yeah,
where,
totally.
first you're just playing at it and you're not really doing it, but then the more you do it, the more familiar you become, the more it becomes you. One of my first teachers, actually the first teacher I ever who led a meditation retreat that I did, was a practitioner whose practice focused on green Tara, who is sort of an embodiment of enlightened compassion. Tara literally means savioress, and she's associated with saving beings in trouble. And so green Tara is visualized by practitioners as a beautiful 13-year-old girl and with green skin.
Mm.
And so this man, who was a sort of middle-aged Tibetan Lama when I first met him, spent probably good 9, 10, 12 hours every day viewing himself as a beautiful 13-year-old green-skinned girl and as doing all the things that this Buddha did. And it was kind of interesting that
Mm.
most of the time he was convincing himself that was him, but he could see in the mirror that he wasn't a beautiful green-skinned girl. But the more that he did this, the more he felt, at least, that he was approximating that state. And so it wasn't necessarily even the physical state, but all of these positive qualities that she was endowed with in the visualization, and then that he tried to become more like that through this visualization.
Mm. I suppose, and your point as well before about whether there's actually any empirical evidence as to the reality or the truth behind karma leads us into questions around what is the self, I imagine too, because it's not, because I'm sure maybe you don't agree, but it makes sense to me that we could nest the idea of karma inside a scientific worldview, given that there's only a finite amount of matter in an infinite universe. And if, the matter is obviously going to be recycled or reused in some way and put into other bodies. But I can't imagine myself as Tom Ahern coming back. Um, you know, although I very much agree with you too, this idea about people remembering their past lives, especially when they're quite young.
Hmm.
Some of that research is fascinating by Ian
Mm.
Stevenson.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you see the scientific basis for that, or where do you go with that?
Well, again, the scientific basis isn't there. I mean, the scientific basis, if you look at it empirically, people live, people die, they decompose.
Mm,
But, I've talked to a number of Tibetan teachers who told me that they are aware through direct perception of this cause and effect, and that they can see themselves, their past lives, going back a long way. They can see the past causing conditions of other people. So for them, this isn't mythology, and it isn't a matter of belief. It's something that they see themselves as seeing directly. But as you said before, what you're doing is you're spending years and years and years conditioning yourself to believe this. And so, of course, you're going to believe it if you're doing it right. And so, if you go into a Buddhist meditation retreat and you tell your teacher after a couple of months, well, I just had a vision of the risen Christ. Your teacher isn't going to say, "Oh, that's really fascinating. We need to explore that." He's going to say, "No, you're getting it wrong. You need to, shape up and start doing this right because you're obviously, off on a wrong track."
and I think it's interesting too as well because if we sort of want to explore the philosophy of science, science it really is based on what can be observed.
Mhm.
And yet we're talking about something here that's so subjective. I wonder if it's, where we sort of lean toward is science, are the limits of science actually the issue here regarding as to whether or not this is true? Do we need to update our Bunsen burners and, rulers, so to speak?
That's a good point. I think that it really is up to the individual. So I know a number of scientists, and most of them are very scientific in their worldview. They don't really have any particular interest in exploring religious claims because they just seem so fanciful and so far-fetched and so, beyond anything that can be established. I know a few who are religious believers, but they're definitely a minority among the scientists that I know of, and I think they probably would be, worldwide. But people who are religious believers also come in many different stripes. I grew up in a Catholic family where I started having doubts really early on, probably about the time I was 8 or 9. And when I started asking about these things that just didn't add up, I was told that I had to have faith. And my response was, well, why would I have faith in something that I have no evidence for? And the evidence is all contradicting, what I'm supposed to be having faith in. And like I could have faith in lots of things. I could have faith in unicorns and so forth, but what's the point? Uh, and so, but I know other people who are perfectly happy to do that. That is, they're born into a Catholic family. They find comfort in this. It's something that answers their questions, that makes them feel part of a community of believers. And so for them, it works fine. For me, it didn't. Uh, for a long time, I studied religion in college and in graduate school, but I really had no interest in actually trying any religious practices. And it was really just a chance meeting that I happened to meet the Dalai Lama while I went to a talk that he gave, and he was with the Karmapa, who was the 16th Karmapa, who was another major religious figure. And I didn't go because I went because a friend sort of dragged me along, and I sort of had to go. And I was really struck by the presence of these guys. There was something about them that just filled up the room, and that was something that was, and I could see it was having the same effect on other people in the room. And it was something I'd never seen before, and it was undeniable to me the presence of these folks had. And so I decided I wanted to learn more about it, and that was when I decided to do my first Buddhist meditation retreat because I wanted to see what sort of practices they did and what sort of effects it might have. But if I hadn't had that experience, I probably would have been perfectly happy, going along and like maybe studying religion, studying. Well, I was mainly interested in history of ideas, how particular ideas developed in Buddhist societies. And so I probably would have been perfectly happy continuing to do that, reading texts in Sanskrit and Tibetan and Chinese, translating them, writing essays on them, and so forth. But as it was, I became interested in how these people got to be, got to have this presence that I was experiencing. And so that was why I started doing Buddhist meditation to see, how it would work out.
That's beautiful. So what, perhaps you could take me back to that moment and the listeners as well. You're with the Dalai Lama
Mhm.
and the other fellow you said, sorry.
The Karmapa.
Okay, yes. So and you have this experience of it's something that's almost like being drawn out within you. Their presence is so there's so much reverence to it that you can't help but feel. I wonder if you could unpack that for me.
Well, they were in a Buddhist church in Toronto, and I'd been with some friends doing a yoga retreat in Northern Ontario in Manitoulin Island for about a week. And then one day, the guy with the car announced that the Dalai Lama was going to be in Toronto the next day, and he wanted to go. And I had zero interest. I mean, everything I'd heard about Tibetan Buddhism was just kind of weird and off-putting, and I really didn't have any interest. But he had a car, so we ended up going. And so when I arrived, I had already decided then that, since I was there, I wanted to go in and see what the Dalai Lama was like and everything, because I figured this was an interesting experience. But I didn't expect to stay. And I knew there was a bookstore nearby, so I was planning to go and get a book, maybe read it, waiting for my friends to finish. And so, but I walked into this church, and it was a big place. And I walked in, and there were probably about maybe 300 people there, and there
Mhm.
were notably about 40 children. And everybody was just transfixed, like, rapt attention, and including the children. Like there was no fidgeting or moving around or, lack of attention. And a lot of it was chanting in Tibetan. There were a bunch of monks there, and they were chanting away. They were banging cymbals and things like that. It was all very foreign. And but there was something about these people that just again sort of filled up the room, and I could see it in the faces of other people there. And of course, the first thing I thought was this is projection. Like they went there expecting to be zapped and to be, in the presence of a holy guy and to have that sort of experience. But I definitely didn't. And so I was struck by the fact that this was something completely unexpected that I was having this experience. And that was why I decided that I wanted to learn more about it. Because I mean, there seemed to be something there that was unexplainable to me and that was interesting.
Yes.
So when I was doing graduate school at McMaster University in Ontario, and I had a friend who was married to a Tibetan woman, and I asked him where would be a good place to study Tibetan Buddhism, and he said you need to go to University of Virginia because they have this program that was founded by Jeffrey Hawkins, who was the Dalai Lama's translator, and the Dalai Lama, who came to Virginia, stayed with Jeffrey for about 6 months, and they developed a program that incorporated elements of the traditional Tibetan Buddhist monastic curriculum at one of the major monastic universities. And so the students had actually studied what the monks studied. They did the sort of debates that the monks did. And there was also a Buddhist center in town that they kept the scholastic stuff and the practice stuff separate. So if you wanted to do, say, an empowerment or a meditation practice, you could go to the Buddhist center. And most of these lamas who came there to the university also did religious things at the center. So you
Mm.
could go, you could do a retreat, you could do like there were teachings like 4 or 5 nights a week. There were regular retreats and so forth. So you could go in, you could actually try it out and see what it was like.
So that's amazing. So I didn't realize that was such a defining moment for you in your life. It really led to a new trajectory,
Yeah,
essentially. Really
yeah.
sort of study this stuff. Yeah.
And I had been interested in it before. I started reading pretty widely when I was about 10 years old. And one of the books that I discovered was D.T. Suzuki's Zen Buddhism.
Okay.
And I found it really interesting. And so then I started reading, well, I read a lot of philosophy. I was very interested in Nietzsche, for instance. I also read Heidegger. I found a lot of what he said very interesting.
Mm.
And I also read a lot of novels. I found novels were very interesting in terms of exploring various aspects of the human experience.
Yes.
And so I found, I read the Upanishads, I read Shankara, I read Taoist materials and so forth, and I read things within the Christian, particularly the Christian mystical tradition.
Mm.
And I was interested in all of them, and I didn't really have any particular interest in doing any of them, but I
Mm.
certainly, was interested in the sort of claims that people were making these, sort of mind-blowing experiences that they were describing, and wondering what it'd be like to have that sort of experience. But didn't really think of myself sitting down on a meditation cushion or anything like that and trying it out. But then when I encountered the Dalai Lama in Toronto, I decided that I wanted to try it out and go a bit deeper. So that's what I ended up doing.
Wow, that's so interesting. Okay, so because I'm quite interested in the mystical traditions as well, Christianity and so on. And one thing I'm not sure if you I'm not sure if this is what pulls you into those. It certainly did when you were younger, 10, and then you started reading this. My God.
I was a
Uh,
precocious 10-year-old.
yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. But I feel like there's a very big difference between sort of experiencing God, if you want to call it that, versus sort of knowing and analyzing it. And I couldn't help but sort of wonder whether or not if there was another incarnation of John, whether or not they would describe the meaning of the Dalai Lama as an experience of God that perhaps you and I would deconstruct as just being lost in a moment of awe, or having this wonderful reverent experience. It's hard to know. I suppose the reason why I keep pulling us back into this area is because I'm really interested in whether or not God can be known, coming back to the opening line of what they talk about in Taoism, I suppose.
Mhm.
Um, but if it can be sort of felt or experienced or something like that. Um, I don't know. Did you ever look back on that moment where when you met the Dalai Lama and look at it through that lens at all, or have I totally lost it?
Well, not really, because one of the things that interested me about Buddhism right from the very beginning, actually, was the claim that God is unnecessary for religious practice.
Mm, mm,
One of the things almost every religious believer I've ever met uses some version of the teleological argument as a core explanation for why they believe in God, that everything has to come from something. So, everything has a previous cause and so forth. So, it can't go all the way back. And so, somewhere there has to be a first cause, an unmoved mover. But the problem is that what that assumes is that everything has to come from a cause, right? And so then, if everything has to come from a cause, then where does God come from? And they say, well,
mm.
God doesn't have a cause. And
Yeah,
so obviously, at least one thing can happen without a cause. And if that's the case, then why not everything happening without a cause?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
the argument falls apart. And so for me, I didn't really see that as a compelling argument at all. And I didn't really feel any personal, I don't know, interest in this idea because, again, it just seems so implausible to me. And the more I thought about it, and I spent a lot of time reading the Bible, reading theology, and so forth. And the more I thought about it, the more the implausibilities just kept me from being able to really give any sort of credence to it.
Yeah.
Like the story of Noah's Ark, for instance, was one of the ones. This is one of the ones when I was 10 that just really bothered me. Like it was so full of holes. Like so you've got well, the idea first of all that people annoyed God, and so God decided to kill everybody by making a giant flood, and he only spared Noah and his family. Well, okay, so he made this flood and everybody drowned, but how about fishermen? How about merchants? They all had boats, so presumably they could have hopped in their boats. Did God go around like, poking holes in all their boats so they wouldn't be able to float? And then, the fact that there are societies like, China, Japan, India that have records that go way, way back before pre-biblical times and don't report anything like a catastrophic flood that wiped everybody out,
Mm,
and that their chronologies keep on going around that time, biblical times and so forth, and there's no mention at all of this catastrophic flood. So why didn't everybody else die, or why didn't it
mm.
affect, this is supposed to affect the whole world? So obviously that they're only thinking in terms of the Middle East and basically this conception of a flat Earth that could be flooded up, whereas the whole idea of the entire globe being flooded just makes no sense at all. Um,
Yes, yes.
and then, when you start looking at, like say, looking at it from an Australian point of view. Okay, so the story, a lot of people think the story says that God required Noah to get two of each, but it was actually seven of most species, and
Mm,
only two of certain species. I think they were called unclean or something like that.
mm.
But so, how about kangaroos? So did they like hop down to the ocean and then like swim thousands of kilometers to the Middle East and hop up to Noah's house? Koalas, they can only eat eucalyptus trees. Did they like chew like a tree and then drag it down to the ocean and then swim across and then swim back again with what was left of the leaves in the tree? It just makes, and then when you start looking at how many species there are in the world,
Yeah.
there's no ship that could have possibly carried all of them. Like even 10 of the largest aircraft carriers, or the largest ships that are available today, they're all made out of metal. They
Mm.
couldn't possibly have handled all of the species that would have had to been saved by this. So it's just full of problems. And almost every story in the Bible is like this. When you start looking at what's behind it, it just falls apart. And the problem of God as an actual reality, for me, is so full of problems that it just doesn't hold up to me.
I think I definitely agree with you in terms of the literal faults. It's just absolutely ubiquitous in the stories. But I think there's something to say about the metaphorical truths, the idea of these stories as yeah, symbols for how to live. I probably couldn't give you one now regarding Noah's Ark,
Mhm.
other than perhaps sort of like being prepared for chaos, or whatever that looks like.
Well,
Um,
the story, the upshot or the moral of the story is that if you make God angry, he'll punish you. But
mm,
I mean, that's through the whole Bible, so you don't
yes,
really need the
especially the Old
story to
Testament,
like
right?
that one. But to get to your point, I do agree with you. I think what you're trying to say, that the experience of people who say involve themselves in Christian mystical practices,
Mm,
uh, that's something that I think is a different sort of thing. I think that it would be hard for somebody like me who just finds this whole thing implausible to do this, but for somebody who has that sort of basic core of belief, to engage in these mystical practices and then find meaning in this and have an experience that's transformative and so forth, and that uh, uh, opens them up to levels of experience that weren't there before. I see that as perfectly plausible.
yeah.
And one of my first experiences when I was an undergraduate, actually, I took a course on mysticism. It
Mm,
was taught by John Esposito, who's now a famous scholar of Islam.
mm,
And one of the first things we did was we took a class trip out to the western part of Massachusetts, to St. Joseph's Abbey, which is a Trappist monastery. I think it was Trappist. I'm pretty
interesting.
sure. Anyway, it was a monastery, and
Yes.
there were these monks there, and there was something. And it was really clear, just looking at them, that there was a sort of peace, a serenity about them, and so whatever they were doing was must have been working.
Mm,
So, they were leading lives of Christian prayer and so forth. And it was, obvious that it was having a positive effect, at least on the ones that we met. Interestingly, though, when we were able to talk to them, well, one thing was interesting was that we had women in the class, so we were sort of like ushered into a private room, and only the most senior monks were able to talk to us because they didn't want the younger monks seeing women and like losing the plot. But
mm,
so we asked this one monk who was clearly, a very wise, contemplative guy, how this worked for them, and he said, well, or what they did for practice, and he said, well, every morning we get up and we do Zen meditation.
no way.
Way.
That's so cool.
And they have a Zen Roshi who came twice a year and did a Zen retreat. And so, we were almost all from Christian backgrounds, and we asked, like, how does this work for you guys? You're all Christians, and yet your main teacher for your meditation is a Buddhist. And
Yeah.
he said, well, the Zen Roshi who we bring is like, he couldn't care less whether we're Christian, Buddhist, Taoist, atheist, or whatever.
Mm,
If we want to do a retreat, he's happy to do it. And we find that this concentration that we do helps us to improve our contemplative lives and to improve our prayer and our ability to focus on God. And so, for them, it was a tool. It was a tool that could be used for many sorts of different things. And again, whatever they were doing was clearly working for them. But when I was looking at this, while I could see that and I could appreciate the fact that it seemed to be having a positive effect on them, it didn't really sound like something that was attractive to me or that would work,
mm.
for me to try to do that.
Yes, but that to me sort of runs parallel with perhaps it's just sort of a definitional thing, or we're sort of up toward the edge of the limits of language,
Mm,
but sort of meditating on God could be the same thing as someone else saying, you know, um, meditating on primordial reality,
mm,
or that which is, or
mm,
emptiness. I think, which is sort of got a Tibetan connotation, Tibetan Buddhism
mm.
connotation. Um,
Well, I think it could have similar effects, at least in the
yeah,
short. But when you look more deeply into these religious traditions, each one of them does make exclusive truth claims.
I see.
And practice claims. So Like the Dalai Lama, for instance, is very ecumenical in his worldview, and he sees all religions as having the same sort of moral foundation. And so he thinks that if you practice within any of the world's religious traditions, like whether it's Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, or whatever, you will develop into the same sort of person. And he also thinks that people of these different traditions would recognize these, people from these other traditions as developing the same sort of qualities they're trying to develop themselves.
Yes, yes.
And he has a book that I think is really interesting. It's called The Good Heart. It's a Buddhist interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And his basic idea is that all religions are trying to produce somebody who has a good heart, somebody who's compassionate, who is loving and empathetic, and all these other positive qualities. And this is done through various sorts of techniques, but the sort of end result is the same sort of person. And I think that I think it's a really good point. But if you were to press him on this, if you were to ask him, could you attain the primary Buddhist goals of, like, say, nirvana, escape from cyclic existence, becoming a Buddha, he would have to say no.
Mm,
Because, I mean, you can really only do these things through Buddhist practices. And I think that, ultimately any Christian would have to say the same thing, that no, if you don't believe in God, if you're doing Buddhist retreats and so forth, and you're meditating in emptiness, you're not experiencing God. You're not embracing, the loving reality of Christ in your life and so forth. And so, no, you're not going to go to heaven because you're not doing the sorts of things that are required for that to happen.
yes. Which is precisely what I struggle with. I feel like I'm the way I described it to a friend recently was I can see the buffet in front of me. I can see everyone sort of enjoying it. I've got my knife and fork in hand, and yet I just can't quite take a bite. I can't really exclusively become any particular religious person because there are things I love about Buddhism. There are some beautiful truths I love in Christianity. I was raised a Catholic myself, but
Mhm.
to exclusively define myself as any one of those would have to, I come up against that edge.
Mm. Well, and I think most people who are thoughtful are probably going to end up with some sort of hybridized vision.
Mm,
And I think particularly somebody who comes from another culture and finds themselves drawn to a particular tradition. Like, say, if you're born into a Christian family and you become a Buddhist, you're probably always going to you're never going to do it like a Buddhist does.
yeah, yeah.
There was an interesting book that was written, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago now. It was called The Jew in the Lotus.
Oh, okay, yes.
And it was about the phenomenon of a really large number of Jewish people who become Buddhists.
Isn't that interesting? Okay.
And the guy, Roger Kamenetz, coined a term for this. He called it Boo Jews.
That's great.
And one of the things that he sort of pointed out is that, when you go to a Western Buddhist center, you can really spot the Jews there
Mm,
because, well, there's another book that I'll mention too. It's called The Nature of Doctrine.
mhm.
And the main point that this guy makes is that, I can't remember his name offhand, but anyway, it'll probably come to me. But anyway, the main point that he makes is that religions are not primarily truth claims. They're like languages. So they enable us to make sense of reality, to say,
Beautiful.
we have all this information coming to us, and religion, whatever religion we have, helps us to structure this, make sense of it, put it
Mm,
into a context. And so he says that talking about, religions as like this one is right, this one is wrong, is missing the point. They're forms, they're ways of communicating with others. They develop a language, and language is not just about communicating with others. It's also, we think in terms of language. So
yes.
we wouldn't be able to experience without language. And so the religion we have is part of that language that we use. And so we fit them all into this language worldview. And so to say that Christianity is right and Buddhism is wrong would be like saying French is right and English is wrong.
That's
They're just
brilliant.
they're just ways of communicating.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And so one of the things that Kevinus points out in The Jew and the Lotus is that if you are born into a Jewish family, you're going to like do Buddhism with a Jewish accent.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
going to be a sort of Jewish way of doing it. And I've seen, like, I can spot people who are from Catholic backgrounds usually pretty easily in Buddhist centers. They sort of ask certain questions, they have certain concerns. Same is true of there've been a number of studies that have looked at the patterns of what people go into from other backgrounds. And so overwhelmingly, people from Catholic backgrounds are drawn to Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the reasons why is because it's sort of familiar to them. They have robes, they have incense, they have elaborate ceremonies. It's all in a foreign language and everything. They feel at home. A lot of Protestants overwhelmingly go for Theravada or Zen, which are much more austere, much less concerned with like sort of symbolism and so forth and pageantry. And they find that more amenable to them. So, again, you're probably going to be drawn to something that you're familiar with. And uh, that sort of reflects what your background is and how you developed cognitively. And so, and I think that's, from my point of view, that's perfectly fine. Whatever floats your boat, if you find something that works for you, where you do these practices and it has a positive outcome for you, what does it matter what happens with other people? If other
Mm.
people are interested, they want to ask, like if you want to ask me questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it. But, if you say, well, so what? It doesn't really bother me.
Yes, yes, I like that. John, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about what I see in private practice, because a lot of existential conversations undoubtedly occur when you're working with someone. We live in a world now that has really taken away a lot of the ways in which we um, found meaning, in our lives, whether it's from sort of Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, or even just sort of existing in small communities where you have an immediate connection with the people that you fend for, with that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of people, I think a lot of young people as well, in their sort of teenage years and 20s are now moving toward Christianity. I'm not sure if you've noticed or heard of
Yeah,
this. Yeah,
yeah.
this idea of sort of being saved by an ultimate rescue. I don't want to reduce it to that specifically. But I've noticed that, no, it's not that I've noticed, but it was actually for our last episode together when I was looking into your work that and trying to figure out a little bit more about Tibetan Buddhism specifically, that these ideas of emptiness, non-self, impermanence, um, I almost felt like they'd be a nihilist's worst nightmare in some ways. And I think now that with a real crisis of meaning in the world, it makes sense to me as to why people are moving toward religions that offer them hope and faith. I am assuming that Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism specifically would have a pretty strong response to it coming across as a nihilistic practice. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, that's one of the things that Buddhism confronted right from the very beginning, that they were accused of being nihilistic.
Mm.
And the Buddhists, of course, denied that. So what they say is that what we're saying is based on empirical evidence and on reasoning. And so there are people who believe that there's an eternal self, and they deconstruct that. They look into the conceptual ramifications of this, and they conclude that any way you look at it, it doesn't make sense. There's no way you can make sense of an enduring self. But actually, they also say that Buddhism, there are lots of wrong ideas in the world, and most of them are not actually going to harm you. Uh, so, if you believe that, like, say, Donald Trump is a great president, it's not, you're wrong, but it's not going to prevent you from leaving cyclic existence or
Sure.
whatever. It may have you other problems, but it's not, this is not the sort of thing that Buddhism is concerned about.
Yeah.
But the belief in itself is, and the reason for that is that you're holding on to a belief in something that doesn't exist, but something that gets in the way of being able to make progress. And interestingly, when I first started studying Buddhism with Buddhists, I realized that, like say the term emptiness, it's a pretty good translation of the Sanskrit term shunyata, but it has connotations in English that are not found in Sanskrit or in Dongvani, the Tibetan version. It's a much more positive thing. And so when Buddhists hear no self or emptiness, they have the same sort of warm feeling that somebody would have like a Christian would have with Jesus, because it's a profoundly limiting concept. So
Yes.
if there were something that was always the same, that never changed, like an eternal essence of you, you could never be different. You would always be stuck being exactly what you are right now, which would mean that whatever problems you have would be permanent. They would be unresolvable. Whereas because things are constantly changing, that means that you can make changes. And so, because there's no enduring self, you can become whatever you choose to become. So, if you take control of the process and you start doing the sorts of things that make positive changes, like that help you to develop compassion and empathy and generosity and insight into the nature of the world and so forth, you should become more peaceful, more happy, less stressed, and so forth. And all these things are very positive outcomes. Not the only way to do this, of course. You can also do therapy, you can take drugs and so forth. That might make you feel less stressed too. But in any event, if you do this right and you keep at it, you're probably going to have positive outcomes.
Mm,
And so uh, that to me makes sense. And having done meditation myself, I've actually seen the positive results from this. And there are other people I know who've tried a retreat or two and didn't really do anything for them. It is definitely something that works for some, doesn't work for others, just as like therapy works for some, doesn't work
yeah,
for others.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, and so, if you're the sort of person that tries this and finds that it works, then you might as well keep doing it. If it doesn't work, then you might try something else.
Okay, so the idea that everything changes as a truth, claim, and just as an aspect of reality, should be, ought to be liberating.
Mhm.
Because if that weren't the case, then to your point, you're stuck in the suffering that you're currently with forever and ever.
Mhm. Yeah.
Amen. To
And
be
you're
honest.
just like you're like a hamster on a treadmill,
Yes, yes,
continually re-traumatizing yourself,
yes.
and that would be horrible.
Yes, totally, totally agree. So then this idea then that awareness remains after death um, has me wanting to ask you what you would define as the self.
Well, I don't think there is a self, and I think that the Buddhists are right about that.
Yeah.
And when you follow these arguments, I think that they really hold up under analysis.
Yes.
And so, what the Buddhists claim is that there's no enduring self, but there is, what we are. When we look to see, what can I identify when I try to find John? Uh, John has a physical body. John has mental events. He has sensations. He has particular biases about things that he likes and doesn't like, and so forth. And then there are other things that I associate with myself, like my name, my family, titles that I have, degrees that I've had, and things that often people associate themselves with their jobs and so forth. And so these are all things that are associated with my sense of self, but all of these are contingent, right?
Mm.
And they're changing from moment to moment. There's nothing, within any of these factors that remains even for 1 second to the next. They're changing all the time, and they're all subject to decay and to passing away. And so now that I'm retired, for instance, I'm no longer a professor. I still am a doctor because I earned a PhD, but that's less important now because I don't actually make a living, doing academic things anymore. So I guess I'm probably less. I think about that less than I did when I was at a university where everybody's a doctor and we often call each other doctor so and so, whatever. But that's less important now. And so as you go through life, these things that you're interested in, these things you identify with, are going to change.
Mm.
And so what we have then is, we have a reality in which things are changing from moment to moment. My perceptions are going to be changing, and so there's nothing underlying all this that I can identify that's permanent. So, one of the things that I often ask my students to do is a thought experiment. Say, well, so if there's a self, like say if there's a soul, can you send it out to the local liquor store to get you a six pack?
Mm.
Well,
Mm.
no, it's insubstantial. It doesn't work like that. I can't do that. I said, well, okay, it's insubstantial. If I'm sick, can I have it go in and tell my boss that I'm not coming into work today? No, it doesn't do that either. Well, and so when you sort of like ask them to identify anything that you can say, well, this is definitely the stuff. It couldn't be anything else. Uh, there's really nothing you can find that clearly is this entity that you believe exists.
Yes.
And so the more you look into this, the more you realize that there's really no reason to think of this, and that actually it just doesn't make sense. That the idea that in a world where everything is changing, where you have things coming into being, passing away in every moment, since we started this conversation, millions of cells in our bodies have died and been replaced by other ones. Every 7 years or so, we go through a complete change of cells. So there's nothing that remains over time. I guess there's some neurons that remain over time, but anyway, that's not really
Sure.
important.
Sure.
But in any event, constant change is the reality of everybody's lives.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things that I found appealing about Buddhism, was that recognition of the reality of change. And then the reality, the corollary of that since things are changing, if we take control of that process of change, it's not going to be a perfect transition, but we can move from where we are now to a better way of existing and a better way of living, a better way of relating to the world and to other people.
Because we can sort of move into alignment with change as
Yeah.
opposed to
And
obstructing
we can take
ourselves.
control of the process of change and think, what sort of changes would I like to make
Yeah.
in order to have an improved outcome?
Given that I
So,
have to align myself with change.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like uh, focusing on compassion,
Yes.
developing wisdom, being more generous, more empathetic, these are all
Mm.
things that would lead to positive outcomes. And so, if I do the sorts of practices that will, that are designed for that, then hopefully I'll have a gradual improvement in these qualities.
So I'm just trying to understand. So correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but it is an aspect of Tibetan Buddhism that believes in awareness existing beyond temporality, or sort of consciousness moving beyond death, or
Well, the consciousness continues. And
yeah.
so they identify five factors. They call the five aggregates. And these are the things that when you look to see, what it is that relate, that correlates with my sense of myself, things like my physical body, my feelings, my consciousness, and so forth. And then what are another one, my personal favorite, non-associated compositional factors, which is mainly karma.
Okay.
So it sort of propels the whole thing along. But also, again, things like your title, your family, your clan, your nationality, the language you speak, all these things are part of the non-compositional, non-associated compositional factors. They're all part
Mm.
of my sense of me. So none of those things is permanent or enduring. But when you die, according to Tibetan Buddhists, the coarser levels of consciousness begin to drop away. And so the death process is sort of a process of gradually casting off or dissipating of the coarser levels of cognition of consciousness.
Mm.
So you get to what is the most basic one, which is called the fundamental innate mind of clear light. And
Mm.
this is like the basic level of consciousness, but it's not a self or a soul because it's changing in every moment. So you can compare it, it's often compared to a river. So the river is flowing along in every moment, and you can never step into the same river twice because the river is always moving along.
Yes.
But there's no place where you can say, I'm in this river, this is the river,
Yes.
it's permanent, it's never going to change because the river is always moving. And
Yes.
consciousness is the same way. So this fundamental innate mind of clear light is moving along at every moment. Now it's normally associated with the coarser levels of consciousness, which is what we operate on and how we relate to the world. But when all this other stuff drops away and this is all that's left, then we are sort of at our most basic level of cognition, and this is what moves on to the next life. So it's propelled by our karma toward a life situation that's concordant with the sorts of volitional actions we did in this life. So
Yes.
the sorts of choices we made, the things that we did, and so forth, all of this is going to lead us to a situation that is appropriate for the sort of things that we did.
How
Uh,
does that align with your worldview? Did you see that as true? If I could ask.
well, I don't know if it's true or not.
Okay.
And I've been asked this a number of times by Tibetan lamas that I've studied with, and I had one lama who got really angry at me for this. But
Oh.
I said, well, I don't have I've never had an experience of the fundamental innate mind of clear light.
Mm.
I've never had an experience of being in the bardo, the intermediate state between lives that I remember.
Mm.
And so I can't confirm, in my own experience that this is true. I can confirm there are people who believe that it's true. You obviously believe it's true to this lama. But I can't say that for sure. So I'm willing to practice as if it is true, and I'm willing to do the sorts of practices that could lead me to that if the tradition is right about it. But until that happens, I'm not going to say yes, I absolutely believe this.
Yes. Yes. No, that's totally fair. I I will go on record to say that I think that's pretty spot on. It just feels right, and I think that I've never had enlightening experiences by any means, but just I'll give you a simple example I'm sure you've had as well. You're sort of reading a book and you read a sentence. I got this when I read Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche.
Mhm.
It's not even a book, right? It's just these insane pithy aphorisms that he throws at you that just
Uh-huh.
his philosophy is just so violently enlightening. It just
Mm,
broke me open every sentence.
mm.
And I
In
remember
your
reading,
face.
yeah, very in your
Mm,
face, right? And I remember reading that book. I was actually living in France with my then partner, now wife, and I remember reading this book, and I've had it with many other books as well, where you just you're it's like these more superficial aspects of you just sort of melt away as you move into a state that feels more like you than you when you're existing as the they self, is what Heidegger would say, right?
mm,
And when I'm in those little moments, let's say, if we put this like an analogy, let's say that enlightenment is level 100 and I was maybe at like 2.3 or something like
mm,
that. That 2.3 felt more like I was sort of one with what was really real in that moment. It wasn't Tom as this separate entity, this illusion. It was Tom who felt this wonderful sense of connectedness with the world,
Mm.
based upon what Nietzsche was describing or what I've read in other books. And that's why I think it's not necessarily coincidental that people who practice this sort of stuff become more compassionate and warm and present. It's because they've sort of melted away more superficial elements of their own ego than perhaps people like me have, or whatever it is.
Well, I think it's absolutely right. And I've done a number of Buddhist meditation retreats, and I spent a lot of time in Buddhist centers. I'll actually be going to one next week in Healesville.
Oh,
I'll
beautiful.
be doing some talks at they have a Buddhist summer school there every year at my
Oh,
treatment
beautiful.
center. So I'll be giving a couple of talks on the use of reasoning and logic in Buddhism, and I'm also going to be interviewing one of my oldest friends, Karma Somo, who
Mm.
is a very wise person, and she's the founder of the largest international Buddhist women's organization,
Oh,
Sakyadhita.
beautiful. Beautiful.
And she's one of the wisest people I know, so I'll be very interested to talk to her. I've done several of these podcasts actually,
Yep.
and the topic is different people's ideas about the relationship between Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist practice.
Mm.
The first person I interviewed was Ayala Aviv, another one of my oldest friends who I've done a couple of research projects with, who I really like. And second, Jin Park, who is another very interesting person and really insightful, very smart. And she's from a Korean background. Her main area of expertise is Korean Buddhism.
Mm.
Ayala is primarily a scholar of Chinese Buddhism, particularly Chinese Yogacara.
Mm.
So the idea is to get people from very different traditions all talking about their ideas about the relationship between philosophy and practice.
Beautiful.
But one of the things that I find when I spend time with people like this is that people who do these sorts of things do tend, like the idea of the good heart, they do tend to
Mm.
become, people who you like to be with because, they embody these positive qualities.
Mm.
But of course, people who are like that are the kind of people who are more likely to want to do that and to do the work.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they're probably inclined in that direction in the first place.
Yes.
But that said, I do think that, like you said, the more you do this, the more likely it is that you're probably going to have a positive outcome. If you don't, you probably shouldn't keep doing it, or maybe if you think that maybe you're just you have a lot of obstacles, you might want to keep at it, but you might find that something else works better for you.
Yes. Yes. It's very practical in that way, isn't it?
Yeah. But
Yeah.
for instance, I did a meditation retreat. I think it was about a year ago now, and I had a really interesting experience. It was a Mahamudra retreat, which is a type of practice within Tibetan Buddhism. And unlike a lot of Tibetan Buddhism, it doesn't involve visualizations or that sort of thing. It's primarily it's a lot like Zen actually in a lot of ways. It's like the idea is that you focus on the nature of mind and you let thoughts drop away. You don't focus on them or hold on to them. And the idea is to rest in the nature of mind. That's
Mm.
kind of the goal, if there is any goal to the practice.
Mm.
And so it's a very sort of quietistic sort of thing, but it's something that's very difficult to do because our thoughts are constantly churning around and we're thinking of things and doing things, experiencing things. So what sounds like a very easy thing to do to just rest in the nature of mind and not think about things, it turns out to be extremely difficult. So this is a week-long retreat, and I'm doing and I had some good sessions where I felt, sort of at peace and at ease and so forth, but certainly nothing like that I would describe as resting in the nature of mind.
Mm.
And I wasn't really thinking consciously of that, like this is what I'm trying to do, like, I need to be in the nature of mind, but I was sort of, there was a Lama who was giving instructions, and I was trying to follow the instructions and do these meditations the way he talked about them. But a lot of it was just, me on a cushion with a group of other people doing this. And then the next to the last session, I had this very interesting experience. I was right at the very beginning of the session. We had done a morning session, then we did some walking meditation, and then we're doing our second sitting meditation. And very soon after I sat and started, going into the doing the meditation, I felt all I could see around me was luminosity, like all in front of me and all to the side of me. And I started, sort of turning my awareness in different ways to see. And so, from about like maybe 20 degrees in back of me, I saw luminosity. I couldn't see directly in back of me. That was one interesting thing to me.
Yes.
So it wasn't 360 degrees. But everywhere I could see was just like the sort of luminous, undifferentiated luminosity. And I felt very much, very centered. Like, I didn't feel any sort of physical agitation at all. I felt very rested, like I was centered in my position.
Mm.
And I sat like that for about, I would guess maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And then I heard this voice that seemed to be coming from just behind the back of my head saying, "This is what it's like to rest in the nature of mind."
Interesting. Isn't
And then I
it?
spent the rest of the session in this sort of very centered, untroubled state where I just was experiencing this total luminosity all around me. Uh, and I thought this is probably like a beginning point for what
Mm.
these, the people who are really adept at this do.
Mm.
That, the people who are really adept at this probably go much deeper into this sort of luminosity, and they probably experience the fundamental nature of mind in a much, much deeper way. But I think it gave me some indication of what it would be like to do that successfully.
Just to rest in that. And it's interesting as well when you see how similar brain states are for those who are on psychedelics versus those who experience meditators as well. You know, it's got something I find it really interesting about how psychedelics tend to disinhibit the left brain. So you're sort of left in that sort of right brain, imagistic, metaphorical, experiential place, and how similar the brains look to people who, as you're saying there, have experienced that luminosity and that fundamental nature.
It's true. I'm very skeptical, though, personally, in the claims that some people make that you can do the same thing, as like say like through long-term serious meditation by just taking a pill.
Yes,
It
yes.
seems unlikely to me. And I've met people who have done a lot of psychedelics and who make, like rapturous claims about it, but they all seem pretty screwed up to me, the ones that I've met at least.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? It's interesting you say that. I read about 6 months ago, I read Ram Dass's autobiography.
Hmm.
Really loved it, and obviously that's how he got so involved in Hinduism. And I don't know if he was necessarily call himself a Hindu, but it was through the use of psychedelics. And his description of this was they can sort of open you up, or I've heard someone describe it as they can sort of take you to the top of the hotel so you can experience the penthouse, but they'll inevitably take you back down. And meditation is the process of sort of climbing the stairs so that your capacity to move between states of consciousness becomes more accessible to you, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And again, I tend to look at the results of what people are like personally. And I've met a number of people, well, a lot of people now who are sort of long-term serious meditators. And almost all of them are people who really, there's something about them that I find very appealing.
Mm.
There's a sort of peace and serenity and a wisdom and so forth. The people that I know who do a lot of psychedelics, none of them are like that. It might be that there are some out there, but I just haven't met any of them.
Yes.
And so, with my own experiences, I tend to value the sorts of things that I actually experience, up front, rather
Yes.
than people's claims about things.
Well, it could have something to do, I suppose, with the nature of psychedelics, as an attempt to heal or solve, or there's a very strong goal aspect to that. There's a strivingness to that.
Mm,
Um, it makes me think of Alan Watts's writings as, the desire to strive for enlightenment is the very thing that's preventing you from accessing it.
mm,
I'm not sure, but yeah, it can make a sort of relationship there.
yeah.
Don't know, don't know. John, I said this to you before on our first episode. I so love talking to you, and I'd love to have you back on the show again. But when you told me that you'd recently retired, there was a question that I thought would be really wonderful to finish on. Um, what are you noticing about yourself and your identity shifting as now being someone who is retired?
Well, I'm still in the process of exploring what retired John looks like.
Yeah.
It's only been a few months now, and I'm
Yeah.
actually still advising one PhD student.
Mm.
And I'm also still working on a number of academic projects. So I just finished an article last week, actually, on the Dalai Lama succession and and Tibetan nationalism and how the Dalai Lama functions as a symbol of Tibetan nationalism.
Mm.
And I'm also still involved in a project that's based at University of Vienna, where we're planning to, well, we need to get funding, but we're planning on doing empirical studies of Tibetan meditators. So looking at people doing these visualization meditations and what sort of changes we can measure through empirical testing procedures.
Mm.
So I was, and we have a yearly meeting in that, and the leader of the project, Tim Reingans, is going to be coming to stay with me in a couple of weeks.
Oh,
We're going to
beautiful.
be talking about this. So I'm actually still doing academic
Yeah.
work. I just don't have to go to meetings anymore, and I don't
Yeah,
have to take
like,
exams.
I mean, it's all the good parts of retirement, right? Just getting rid of
Exactly.
all the
So I can
shitty
do what
parts.
I want to. I'm reading more novels now. I'm
Yeah.
spending more time doing things that I enjoy doing, and I don't have to do things that I don't like. So all in all, retirement is working out pretty well
Yeah,
so far.
pretty good. Nice.
And the other thing is that living in Australia, we have this great superannuation system.
Mm.
And so I started working here in 1995, and I now have enough money that even though I'm drawing off of my super account, it's still actually increasing.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm not actually losing any money by, dipping into my retirement fund. So it's pretty cool.
It's working out well. That's great. That's great. Oh,
But
I
yeah,
love it.
I'm still in the process of exploring what it will be like to be fully retired.
Mm.
And overall, I must say I really like it.
Hmm.
Because I always enjoyed my work. I enjoyed giving lectures and so forth. I'm still doing that too.
Mm.
I'll be giving a course on mysticism at the local university, the Third Age,
Mm.
in the second term of this year, and I did a course on Asian religions last year for them. So, I'm going to the summer school next week to do that. So, I'm
Yes,
still doing a lot of things that I used to do, but I'm not grading exams anymore or going to morning academic meetings.
totally. Well, I mean, it's very hard to retire, you know, a vocation, isn't it? Something that's clearly, giving your life a hell of a lot of meaning and something that,
I know
really,
people who do though. I have a couple of
yeah.
friends. One guy I know, for instance, who is one of the world's leading experts on Chinese Buddhism, well, Chinese philosophy in general. And as far as I can tell, he just completely retired.
Wow.
He's growing olive trees. He's running a farm basically, and I don't, as far as I know, he's not doing anything with his former academic work.
That's a bold move. I love that.
Mhm. Yeah.
I've never been good at cold turkeying things.
Mm.
So I think I'd be more like you, I'd be sort of like veering out or sort of transitioning slowly. But
Yeah. Well, what I find is that I can decide, do I still want to do this?
yes,
So if people ask
exactly.
me to do something and I don't want to do it, I can say, no, I'm retired now.
Very
But if I do
true.
want to do it, like this Dalai Lama thing, I thought that would be an interesting project. And so I decided to say yes.
I love that. I love that. Well, John, honestly, thank you so much again for joining me. It's wonderful to catch up. I'm looking forward to the next one. Hopefully, you're still open to it. I haven't caught you when you've really transitioned into retirement.
Mhm.
But
Maybe in a few months you can see how things are working out in the retirement
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Finally, is there anything that you wanted to mention? I just want to give you the final word from our podcast today. Anything that we should reiterate or conclude with, touch on?
Not really. I'm not the sort of guy who likes giving advice for one thing. If somebody asks me questions, I'm happy to answer them, but
Mm.
I've never really felt comfortable being in a position where somebody asks me to, help them live better or live differently.
Yes.
So if somebody wants, my perspective on things, I'm happy to do that. But I've always felt very uncomfortable trying to tell people what they should do or how they should live or whatever.
Yes.
So I think
I love
that,
that.
if I were to do that sort of thing, I would probably say you should find what works for you and then try to do it.
I was going to say, I think what's implicit in that is actually the perfect advice.
Mm.
Seek your own truth, right?
Yeah, I think so.
John, thank you so much once again.
Okay, great talking to you, Tom. Thanks for inviting me.